Good afternoon, class. This is Damon Fordham, and this is the last lecture for the semester for History 104 at the Citadel. And after this class, I'm going to I'm going to post your study guides for your final exam and give you instructions on that for Monday. But for right now, I'm going to finish up speaking of the Cold War, of the post-World War II world up to the present day. Now, I left off talking about how Harry Truman, after Adolf Hitler had killed himself, we won the war in Europe, and there was the matter of Japan. Well, Harry Truman had to make the decision on whether it was better to have X 100,000 American soldiers killed in a land battle in Japan or drop the nuclear weapon on Japan. Well, he sent a telegram to the leadership of Japan saying that, hey, look, either you surrender or else you're going to deal with some really serious stuff. They refused to surrender. So on August the 6th, 1945, President Truman dropped the nuclear bomb, ordered the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And so that caused major damage and death through Japan. And this type of destruction had never been seen by any weapon in human history up to that point. So Truman calls up the Japanese leadership. Okay, you see what you're in for now. Do you surrender? They wouldn't surrender. Said, all right, we warned you. And on August the 9th, 1945, a second nuclear bomb was dropped on Japan. Flesh dangling off human limbs and so forth. And so radiation and such. Now, at the same time that all this was happening, my father was at South Carolina State University when he got his draft notice. And he missed out on his senior year, and he wound up in Saipan, not very far from Japan. And he died relatively young in 1984 when he was 61 and I was 19. And to this day, I kind of believe that this might have something to do with it. But nevertheless, though, the destruction of much of Japan after that caused the Japanese government to unconditional surrender. And the end of the war came when General MacArthur signed a peace treaty with the Japanese aboard a ship on September the 2nd, 1945. And that was known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. And that was when the war ended. People went nuts, celebrating all over the place. And you probably saw the famous picture of the sailor, kissing this lady in Times Square and all that. You know, it was a great time for everybody, with a couple of exceptions. See, my dad served in the segregated army at that time. And on one occasion, when he was at that camp down in Hinesville, Georgia, right outside of Savannah, the cook had served my father and his men scrambled eggs with broken eggshells. Things like that would happen. And black soldiers would sit behind the German POWs and be treated better than them and so forth. And so in 1948, one of the great African-American leaders, a man named A. Philip Randolph, demanded that Harry Truman integrate the Army, or else he would encourage African Americans to refuse military service. And that led to the integration of the United States Army after all of this. So while this is happening, however, I told you in the last class that Stalin had made an agreement with Stalin at Yalta to where he would basically take over some of the conquered nations of Europe. And that led to the division of West and East Germany, as well as places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary belonging to the Soviet Union. And Winston Churchill made a speech in Missouri not too long after that, where he said that there's an iron curtain coming down over Europe. And this meant the communist domination of much of Eastern Europe under Russia. Now, I know some of you listening to this are going to say, well, wait a minute, you don't think they figured that out before they signed this deal at Yalta? Well, ladies and gentlemen, hindsight is 2020, okay? And since they were dealing with the vicious enemy of Adolf Hitler, they kind of saw Stalin as somewhat of the lesser of two evils. But the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is this. When you're dealing with the lesser of two evils, guess what? You're still dealing with evil. Think about it. Now, having said that, the American troops came home to basically guaranteed salary. I believe they got like $20 a month or something like that for a whole year. And they had what was called the GI Bill that would help them pay for college loans and housing loans and things like that. And this was a direct response to the bonus marches of the 1930s. They didn't want to see that happen again, but they rewarded the American soldiers for the most part with gratitude once they came home. And soon they began to, with these FHA loans, buy homes in the suburbs and all that. And people like my father were able to finish their college educations and such. And basically this was the rise of the middle class, you see. Many of the soldiers went back to college on the GI Bill. They were buying these homes filled with electricity and running water and so forth. And so you begin to see the suburban boom over here. But while that's going on, many of the issues of race would be unresolved in America for a few years. And there was also this issue of colonialism. You see, part of the four freedoms that the big three leaders, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, agreed in on paper was the idea of self-determination of nations. And those nations began taking them up on that. Mohandas Gandhi was leading a nonviolent resistance in India for about some 30 years prior to this, and had been in jail for that, for dealing with nonviolent protest against the British government in India. They granted independence to India in 1947, but there was a Muslim leader named Muhammad Jinnah, and they promised Muhammad Jinnah a nation for the Muslim people that he would be allowed to rule. And they divided Pakistan out of India, and that's how Pakistan came into being. And India was left basically for the Muslims, the Hindus and the Sheiks, and that kind of broke Gandhi's heart. And this was leading to a lot of division between the Muslims and the Hindus in India. A lot of violence between the two groups, and so finally, Gandhi was assassinated on January the 30th, 1948, when one of the Hindu people, Gandhi himself was Hindu, by the way, felt that he was making too many concessions to the Muslims. Sad. But fortunately, India then fell into the hands of a leader by the name of Nehru. Nehru was a man with very Western sensibilities, but he was a very forward-thinking type guy. And he managed to do quite well in the leadership of India. Now, meanwhile, in China, up to this point, you had a battle for many years between the nationalists, led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. And they'd been warring for a number of years and so when the Japanese invaded China in 1931, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek said, ceasefire, no more war. They did something that a lot of Americans would find difficult to understand. They joined forces, put their differences aside to come together and fight the Japanese, to get the Japanese out of China. And once that was done, the war went back again. the Civil War. And it ended with, to the surprise of many people, of Mao Zedong and the communists defeating Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, and Chiang Kai-shek retreated to a small island called Taiwan. All right? And Mao became the leader of nearly 1 billion people. All right? So now keep in mind, by this time, the America and Russia's relationship went because they saw that they were not bringing democracy to these nations. They had this thing called the Berlin Airlift in 1948, where the Russians blockaded West Berlin, had a blockade around West Berlin, and so the United States would have airplanes drop food in there. And the United States also developed this, had this thing called the Marshall Plan, in which it would support nations that it once defeated. In other words, to keep, of course, people on their side. Germany, while split between West Germany and East Germany, they also went through a period called denazification, where the Allied forces basically tried to unbrainwash the people out of racist and Nazi thinking. Okay? Because Eisenhower shocked them when Eisenhower and his men rolled into Germany in 1945 during the Allied occupation. He had the German people come out of their houses, out to the concentration camps, and said he wanted the world to see what they did and wanted the German people to see that, and they wanted to drive into the minds of the German people how evil Nazism was to keep it from coming back. Okay? Well, also it's important to discuss that during the war, another Asian country that was fighting Japan was getting a lot of aid from the United States and guns and all of that, and that was Vietnam, led by a fellow by the name of Ho Chi Minh, whose name translates into He Who Enlightens. Well, there was one problem, though. You see, He Who Enlightens was not only anti-Japanese, but the French had ruled Vietnam for a number of years prior to this, and he wanted the French out. And France was America's buddy. So Ho Chi Minh, after America helped him kick the Japanese out, he declared Vietnam independent and read the Declaration of Independence, our Declaration of Independence, that is, at their inauguration. Problem that the U.S. had was that he was a committed member of the Communist Party. And America feared this domino theory that if China was successful in Asia, that all of Asia would fall to communism and all of that, and we'd have our hands full pretty much, okay? So we got into this thing to where we would support a divided Vietnam. North Vietnam for the communists and Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam that was supposed to be for democracy. But the problem was that the South Vietnamese government was run by people who did not have a whole lot of get a lot of loyalty from their followers. People like Ngo Dinh Diem, I hope I'm saying that correctly, who would have these massacres of the Buddhists and such. And it just got to be a hot mess. France fought to get Vietnam back and were defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Vietnam was partitioned, and America began to give aid to South Vietnam. But Ho Chi Minh first wanted help from Harry Truman in the beginning, and Harry Truman ignored him, and the rest got to be a grand mess. Meanwhile, in Africa, many of the nations that were in the Berlin Conference and all of that, they said, no more of this. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana threw off the British yoke in 1957, and many African nations followed. But in 1960, there were like about at least 20 or 30 that eventually became independent. But in South Africa, there were these Dutch white people of Dutch, mostly Dutch and Dutch ancestry, called the Afrikaners, who took over what they call the Nationalist Party in 1948. And because they wanted the cheap labor of the blacks who would work in the diamond mines and things like that, they had a system called apartheid, which would not only segregate these people, but would deny them basic human rights to keep them as a permanent class of cheap labor that would make this government rich. And that, of course, led naturally to protest. There was a group that was formed many years earlier called the African National Congress, who was fighting for the rights of African people. And in the 1950s, they had a charismatic leader by the name of Nelson Mandela, who was leading strikes against the government and so forth. And at first, they were nonviolent. But in 1960, they killed a group of African men, women, and children at a place called Sharpsville, who was involved with the nonviolent demonstrations. And Nelson Mandela got up and said that there are many people who fear that it is useless and futile to talk about peace and nonviolence against a government who replies with savage attacks on unarmed women and children. And so they went to do sabotage against various munitions factories, against the South African government, and they tried to see to it that no human life was taken in the sabotage attacks. So Nelson Mandela went underground for a couple of years, and he was eventually ratted out. And he did it. Then they had him in trial. And they found evidence of sabotage and all that. So they tried him and several of his comrades, some who were white and some who were of Asian Indian ancestry, I might add. And they were going to sentence him to death. But the day that the judge was about to sentence him, he made this brilliant, eloquent speech, which incidentally you can find it in your reader. And if not, look up the Ravona trial speech on YouTube, if you would like to hear it, where he basically said that, essentially, that I have fought against white domination. I have fought against black domination. I have fought for a South Africa where all can live in peace and harmony. It is an ideal for which I would love to live, but if need be, it is an idea for which I am prepared to die. And there were 100,000 Africans out there in the streets saying, "Free our leaders." So they sentenced him to life in prison instead of giving him the death penalty. So then in Cuba, if this weren't enough, they had a dictator by the name of Fulgencio Batista. And he was overthrown by a group of men who went into the hills, led by a bearded young college-educated revolutionary by the name of Fidel Castro. Now, when Castro led his troops into Havana on January the 1st, 1959, Batista was such a brutal dictator that the people were happy, right? But Castro did a little interesting trick. While he was speaking, a dove flew and landed on his shoulder while he was speaking. So you could imagine the common everyday Cuban's reaction to that, right? Turns out he put birdseed on his shoulder, and they were and the loosening of the dove was timed. Slick, right? Well, problem with that was that he was buddy-buddy with the Russian leader that they had at the time named Nikita Khrushchev. And Castro was against the United Fruit and other industries such as that from the United States and Cuba. So he was Cuba si, Yankee no. And so then, you had the Cuban landlords and the wealthy of Cuba. He had them executed in the soccer fields. So, of course, the United States isn't going to have this. And this would lead into the Bay of Pigs disaster. But before I get into that, it's important that I talk about the leadership at this point, okay? All right, General Eisenhower, who helped win the war, he became president in 1952. And it was during his presidency that Brown versus Board of Education, which the Supreme Court said that segregation in schools were illegal, took place. But schools would remain segregated for many years afterwards. Okay, that's 1954. South Carolina integrated its first school in Charleston at Rivers High School, now the School of Math and Science, in August 30th, 1963. And I didn't go to an integrated school myself until 1971, all right, after 2 years of being educated. So, so that was one of the things that led to the civil rights struggle. Of course, there's the most famous story in African American history about Rosa Parks and the bus and all of that, which I'm sure that most of you know. But that was one of many cases going on throughout the South at that time. And there was a movement in Charleston where in 1960, some students from Burke High School sat in at the Crest over on Wentworth Street in order to be served. And there was, of course, violent reaction to much of these things. Until, of course, now as for Martin Luther King, what happened with him was that he was a minister who had just graduated from Boston University with a PhD. He was preaching at the Dexter Street Baptist Church down in Montgomery. And because of his articulation, he was chosen to be the leader of that movement. He got up during the Rosa Parks protest and said, there comes a time when people are tired of being trampled by the feet of oppression. He said that if we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, then Jesus Christ was a utopian dreamer. And if we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. And he led the nonviolent protests that managed to integrate the buses within about 381 days. And that was the beginning of an organized civil rights movement. Here in Charleston, there was a man named Esau Jenkins who only had a 4th grade education, but was helping to register African Americans to vote and setting an example by forming his own businesses. And he became Dr. King's right-hand man here in Charleston. And if you go on YouTube, you can also look at the speech that Dr. King gave when he was in Charleston in 1967. And there were people like that around the United States. There's Medgar Evers in Mississippi. There was Mother Majeska Simpkins and Reverend Ida Quincy Newman in Columbia. There was Reverend Booker T. Sayers Sr. up in my hometown of Spartanburg, South Carolina. There was Alexander Luby in Nashville, Tennessee. And I could go on with that. But it's safe to say that wherever you had a city with a large black population, you had a popular leader leading a major movement. Okay, so when Eisenhower's term ran out, the presidential election of 1960 was between his former vice president, Richard Milhous Nixon, and this flashy young senator out of Massachusetts, who they had a televised debate in 1960, and Richard Nixon didn't shave, and he spoke in his deep, gravelly voice and so forth, and was very pale and uncomfortable looking. And then there was this tanned, red-haired guy with shining blue eyes, cool, calm, and collected, talking about the new frontier. His name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and he had this accent from Boston, which basically made him a very charismatic type figure. And he won. And when he won, he told the country that to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, and so forth, right? And he promised this new frontier, which would have space exploration, a Peace Corps, and all of that. And what was really interesting about this is that when he was running, Martin Luther King was very controversial. And Dr. King was arrested down in Georgia on a very trumped-up charge of an expired license plate and was sent to a major penitentiary in Reidsville, Georgia. Well, they asked Richard Nixon, who had known Martin Luther King for a while, to comment on that, but he refused to do so because he wanted the Southern votes. But Senator John F. Kennedy called his wife, Coretta, "Mrs. King, this is Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I am calling to make sure that everything is okay with your husband, and I understand that you have a baby on the way. Wishing you much blessings." Well, that led to Mr. Kennedy getting the black vote and the presidency. But he was hesitant to advocate too hard on the side of African Americans because he wanted the Southern vote. But it eventually came to the point that when Dr. King and his followers were demonstrating in places like Birmingham, they showed the dogs and the fire hoses and all of that, beating little children and this type of thing. And that gave Kennedy the momentum to call for a Civil Rights Act in 1963. But unfortunately, he was assassinated when he went to Dallas, Texas on November the 22nd, 1963. And as vice president, a Texan named Lyndon Baines Johnson became the president. And Mr. Johnson said that he would work and press for this civil rights bill that Mr. Kennedy fought for so long. And they got that passed in 1964. And that's one of the reasons why I'm able to speak to many of you at the Citadel in Charleston Southern University today. And speaking of which, the Citadel was integrated in 1966 by Charles Foster, who graduated in 1970. The same year that at the same time that Charles Foster graduated, I was about 2 blocks away going to a segregated kindergarten. Interesting irony, right? Well, but however, the situation in Vietnam becomes dire. They have incompetent leadership. And so Lyndon Johnson increases the American troops from being just advisors into combat troops in what's called Operation Rolling Thunder. And Lyndon Johnson understands that the South Vietnamese government is very incompetent, but he feels that he simply cannot let Vietnam fall to the communists, or at least make a show of trying to save South Vietnam from going to the communist way. But the war ends up very badly because of the incompetence of South Vietnam, the seeming lack of will of the South Vietnamese people in this fight and all that, and Ho Chi Minh's popularity in the North. Even though Ho Chi Minh was not the nicest of people, he did some really vicious torture of his opponents, as was often the case in wartime to begin with. But it, folks, was a grand mess. And the American people were very divided on it. There were many on one hand who felt that my country right or wrong, and there were others who felt that this war was not serving a constructive purpose. And so, you know, today, when you have the issues between the Democrats and the Republicans and the people who like Trump and the people who like Vice President Biden and people like Bernie Sanders, it's still largely verbal. But people were fighting in the streets over this stuff back in the 60s. And at places like Kent State University on May the 4th, 1970, it got deadly. And while this is happening, African Americans' patience had run out by this point. Leaders such as Malcolm X and eventually the Black Panther movement and all that, they grew tired of Dr. King's ways of nonviolence, and they felt that nonviolence was not working fast enough. And so thus you had riots in the late 1960s over a lot of those conditions. And of course, for the people who were inclined to be bigoted, they sort of tried to use that as an excuse not to press forward with civil rights. So I say all that to say that people who think that in our own time the country is so divided and all than never before, anybody who tells you that doesn't know history. Let that sink in for a moment. So, Lyndon Johnson loses popularity in spite of the Civil Rights Acts and the Anti-Poverty Acts because of Vietnam. And in the wings comes John F. Kennedy's charismatic brother, Robert F. Kennedy. And Robert F. Kennedy is young, handsome, everything that Lyndon Johnson isn't, and announces that he's going to run for president in 1968, and he was and so Lyndon Johnson then quit. But just as that happens, 4 days later, Martin Luther King, who by this time is not only preaching civil rights, but the end of the Vietnam War as well as trying to eliminate poverty in America, he goes to Memphis and on to deal with garbage collector strike and is assassinated on April the 4th. On that same day, my parents took me to Condon's department store in downtown Charleston to buy an Easter suit for me to make for church on Easter Sunday, which was a little over a week after that. And we were at my grandmother's house when they announced they had, "This is a CBS News special report." And we received word that Martin Luther King was killed, and my parents were crying. Of course, it took me years to figure out why they were crying. But anyway, the riots continued on the college campuses. They were burning the campuses, many campuses, over the Vietnam War and all of that. And you had radical groups that were blowing up buildings over this issue and all that. You had the issues, you talk about nowadays with heroin and things like that. They were using things like LSD and all that. It was just a really grand mess in the late 60s. But since I was a child, I was safely ensconced at my grandmother's house and with my parents and all of that. I was being a kid, so I was only dimly aware of any of these things. So, just like I'm sure there are children now growing up with the coronavirus and the political discord we have now, for the most part, they're still enjoying being kids, except for having to stay inside for this, right? Well, anyway, it came out that Nixon, in the 1968 election, made a deal in which they would hold off certain peace negotiations until after the election. And Nixon wound up winning the election in 1968 against Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey. And right before that, some African American students were protesting a bowling alley who was segregated up in Orangeburg at South Carolina State, and three of them were shot to death by state troopers. And then on May 4th, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, a number of young people were protesting the Vietnam War, and they were shot down. Like I said, you can't compare this stuff that's happening today with the mess that was going on back then. But eventually Nixon got in trouble because in the 1972 elections, they found some of his men were elite, broke into the Democratic Party headquarters, and they were, doing these secret recordings and so forth. And to make a very long story short, April the 9th, 1974, as my dad was taking me from a science camp at Wando High School back home, on the radio, Nixon resigned and his Vice President Gerald Ford took over. Well, Vietnam was eventually settled in that we had a ceasefire and the American troops pulled out, ironically, the day that Lyndon Johnson died. Not too long before this. This was when I was in second grade. And, but things deteriorated further in Vietnam to the point that in 1975, the North Vietnamese ran into the South and took it over pretty much. And many Vietnamese ran to the American embassy and tried to hang on to the helicopters to escape communism. And that was basically the first war that we actually lost. Sad time. But after Vietnam ended and after the Watergate scandal where Nixon resigned and all of that, there was, things kind of settled down a bit for a long period of time. America celebrated its 200th anniversary, the bicentennial, in 1976 when I was 12 years old, and I was involved with some programs like that when I was a kid, and it was a pretty interesting time. Jimmy Carter became the president, the governor of Georgia, and I met him once, pretty decent fellow, but then in 1979, we were involved with this guy called the Shah of Iran. And he had what we later learned was a brutal dictatorship in Iran. And a Muslim cleric named Ayatollah Khomeini took over, and the Shah went in exile. And they captured 63 Americans as hostages. He would later let the black and female hostages, for the most part, go down to where it was 50 hostages. And that was one of those things that caused America to unite over this. But unfortunately, President Carter was unable to free these hostages as much as he tried. And so Ronald Reagan, the governor of California, ran against him in 1980. And Reagan, kind of made it clear that he was no pushover. So he won. And the day that President Carter was to give up office and hand it over to Ronald Reagan, they freed the hostages. I was in high school then. So but we were still having a lot of trouble with the Middle East, because in the Middle East, you had these, in the Middle East, Russia had invaded Afghanistan in 1980, and they had these troops who were fighting the Russians called the Mujahideens. One of them was a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden. Right. And that was the beginning. That was a lot of trouble for us over there, because Russia fought there for about 10 or 12 years, and they eventually left. And then President Reagan, he at one point, we got into this thing where we were exchanging guns for hostages and so forth, because another group of hostages were taken and such. But however, Reagan went to Berlin in the mid-'80s and where they had the Berlin Wall, where the communists had separated East Berlin and West Berlin. And the premier of Russia at that time was a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. And he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And he was a very hardcore anti-communist. And the result of that was that in late 1987, before I was about to graduate from the University of South Carolina, he signed a treaty with Premier Gorbachev that led to reduction in the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Then, when his vice president, he served out his term, and then his vice president, George Bush Sr., was elected president. And it was during the term of George Bush Sr. that a lot of interesting things happened. The communist countries pretty much fell apart after that. The people in Berlin, they literally tore down the wall. Then in South Africa, there became a movement to free Nelson Mandela and end the apartheid segregation out there. And that led to the government freeing Mr. Mandela in 1991. And he became the president of South Africa in 1994. And that was pretty much the end of apartheid. Mr. Mandela went on to become a well-known elder statesman and figure of peace around the world. Now, while that's happening, however, Saddam Hussein over in Iraq began to invade Kuwait. And so we got into a war over that fortunately didn't last long, but he refused to invade Baghdad and capture Saddam Hussein. So the economy started going south around this period, and thus George Bush Sr. was replaced by Bill Clinton. Then, during Clinton's term, however, things kind of stabilized for a little bit with all of this. However, he got involved with this affair with Monica Lewinsky, which didn't end his presidency, but left it severely damaged. But he served out his full second term. And then George Bush Jr. became president after there was this long, contested, drawn-out battle over whether he really won in Florida or not. But as the 20th century became 21st, though, things were looking kind of okay. But then, September 11th, 2001. Most of you who were in this class were either infants or not born yet, but I was teaching my first year at College of Charleston. I'd gone jogging that morning. My mother was up in age, so I was taking care of her at the time, and so did a little jog. I went back home, took a bath, and right before I began to take a bath, I saw that this plane had gone through the Twin Towers. You know, they had another one of those, this is a CBS News special report type of thing. So I took my bath, got out, dried off, put on my clothes, and I saw that another plane had gone through another building and the towers had collapsed. I'm like, wow, this is serious. So I started eating my breakfast, and my mother, who was in her late 70s at the time, she said, Damon, what's the Pentagon? And I said, oh, that's where, Pentagon, that's where the Army's headquartered. Why'd you ask? She said, somebody attacked the Pentagon. I'm like, what? Well, I went ahead to drive to College of Charleston and heard this rumor on the radio that they had attacked the United States Capitol. Well, it turned out to be a rumor, but that's when I pulled my car into the Texaco gas station. I lost it. So I found out that they were going to have us teach anyway, and I really didn't want to do so. But a couple of students, talked me into it. And so I went into the classroom, and I'm dealing with these hysterical students, and I'm like, wow, I'm supposed to say something and deal with this? Wow. So I got up and I told the students, your parents were around when Kennedy was killed. I was around when Dr. King was killed. Your grandparents lived through the Pearl Harbor. This is your moment. Write about it and tell your children. And after that, I went into the lesson. Every now and then I meet young people who tell me, hey, you were my professor during 9/11. But, well, you know, that's not exactly what I want to be remembered for, but it's still a part of history. And I think it gave them appreciation of history. But in either case, though, it was found that bin Laden was responsible, so we declared war on Afghanistan. And then there were rumors that Saddam Hussein was also involved with this, so we also got this war with Iraq. And, well, that led to a long, proctated, drawn-out war. And after a while, this and the economy started crashing around 2008 or so. And all of a sudden, in the midst of all of this, comes this young guy out of Illinois who gets up there and says, there is no black America. There is no white America. There is one United States of America. Yes, we can. I'm like, oh, who was this? You might have heard of him. His name was Barack Hussein Obama. Got to meet him about a couple of years after he made this great speech. He spoke at Burke High School, right by the Citadel. 2007, there's a young girl named Charity Chisholm, who spoke before him. She was student body president. And afterwards, he got up there and said, ladies and gentlemen, before you clap for me, you give a hand to this young lady because the children are the future and they need our encouragement. I'm like, whoa, this guy's great. And so I did get to meet him afterwards, and he was a pretty pleasant person. And he was preaching a message of unity at the time that the country liked. So even though he was running against John McCain, who was a pretty qualified guy and a war hero and such, he was captured in Vietnam and served in prison in North Vietnam for 5 years. Mr. Obama won, and when President Obama became elected, became first African-American president, John McCain was in Arizona, and the crowd began to boo when he said Obama was elected. He said, stop that. He is your president. You show him respect. You see, back then, there was this unique idea that if you were opposed to somebody politically, you could actually still respect each other and get along. Well, he served out his term, and the president today is Donald John Trump. Most people didn't think he was going to win, but he did. And the war ended in Iraq on President Obama's watch, and they're negotiating as we speak, ending the war in Afghanistan, and now we're going through this thing called the coronavirus as we speak, and that's our history since the end of the Cold War. And it's been a pleasure teaching you this class. I wish I was able to be in front of you personally, but This is the next best thing. Have a good life, folks. Take care.